Ms. Warnken, you can proceed.
My name is Heather Warnken, and I am the Executive Director at the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore School of Law. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this very important briefing today. Prior to my current role, I served as a visiting fellow at the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, in the first ever position dedicated to bridging the gap between research, policy, and practice to improve the response to crime victims. Through this role, I facilitated collaboration across federal, state, and local government partners, practitioners, researchers, and directly impacted communities in the design and implementation of equitable, data-driven programs and policies nationwide. Through written testimony, I've detailed numerous subtopics I will not have time to address today, but I have chosen a few key points to highlight, starting with racial disparities in crime victim compensation. Victim compensation, as we've heard, is one of the nation's dedicated resources for helping victims, providing financial assistance for expenses incurred as the result of being a victim of crime. These expenses, such as medical and mental health needs, funeral and burial, and lost wages, are not borne equally. A large body of evidence demonstrates profound racial disparities in risk for violent victimization and its impacts, with low-income communities of color bearing the brunt of these costs. In communities where violence is concentrated, the impact of this trauma combines with chronic disinvestments, lack of support services, and an over-reliance on policing, prisons, and jails. These conditions often break down social trust and breed cynicism towards government. Compensation programs give government agencies a different way to respond to victimization outside of the criminal legal framework of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. And in doing so, they provide the opportunity for government agencies and community-based organizations to build trusting relationships that are needed to interrupt cycles of violence and solve crime. So in other words, this is not just about the healing and dignity of victims. This is about public safety. By assisting with these destabilizing expenses, compensation helps reduce the risk of future victimization and the long-term costs of violence to the state. Across the country, as we've heard, notwithstanding the potential of these programs to meet the needs of survivors and promote systemic legitimacy, compensation has been accessible to the majority of victims. A growing body of research demonstrates that Black and brown victims, in particular those living in low-income communities, are least likely to be seen and served as victims of crime. Despite these higher rates of violent victimization, compensation programs disproportionately deny and/or alienate applicants of color, especially Black men and youth, impacted by gun and other forms of community violence. There are a range of problems undermining program effectiveness, including a paradoxical reliance on reimbursement, requiring victims to pay upfront the cost of compensable expenses, even though the program is intended for people who lack such resources. Unreasonable attempts to promote victim cooperation and reporting to law enforcement, as we've heard. This is especially unjust for victims who may fear or distrust police. Blaming the victim by operating on a flawed model of only supporting, quote, innocent victims, leading to determinations of worthiness that are too often influenced by race and other discriminatory factors, and a harmful reliance on criminal justice system fines and fees to fund these benefits. A proliferation of states have recently introduced or passed legislation designed to improve compensation, and the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime will soon release updated guidance from the federal level for the first time in a generation. This is hopeful, needed work. However, compensation reform or any number of other programs will mean very little without the courage to do the more difficult, longer-term work of changing the culture in which these programs must be implemented. This includes confronting the role of racism in determining whose harm matters and moving beyond not just talking points that we can't police and prosecute our way out of violence, to actions and investments that repair and rebuild relationships rooted in dignity and a more holistic set of public safety goals. Another area I'd like to highlight is the false dichotomy between who we view as victims and perpetrators of harm. In addition to stark racial disparities in rates of incarceration that have made the U.S. an outlier across the world, a large body of research has confirmed the prevalence and severity of victimization before, during, and after incarceration. But lesser discussed are the explicit and implicit barriers created to being seen and served as victims after someone has touched the criminal or juvenile justice system. The extent to which we criminalize rather than heal victimization and trauma, and how much more expensive this is. In 2021, while still at DOJ, I had the honor of leading an assessment for the City of Baltimore and Victim Services, focused on the response to Black and brown victims of gun violence. The findings of this report, similar to those I've encountered in my work in numerous other cities, were again laid bare when I participated this summer in the response to victims of the devastating mass shooting in Brooklyn homes. Too often, residents impacted by violence, especially those who are poor or have ever touched the system previously, are more likely to be criminalized rather than seen as human beings deserving of dignity and support. Even surviving loved ones of homicide victims, witnesses at crime scenes, people fighting for their lives in hospital beds, all experience additional trauma, rights violations, coercion, misinformation, barriers to existing services in the course of investigations and beyond. Now, these dynamics don't just fail victims in their most difficult moments. They profoundly worsen the relationship between the community and police and the system as a whole. They undermine law enforcement's own investigative goals. They miss opportunities to interrupt cycles of harm. I want to close with a quote from criminologist Elliot Curry's breathtaking book, A Peculiar Indifference, the neglected toll of violence on Black America. Quote, America continues to tolerate one of the most fundamental inequalities imaginable, a radical disparity in the very prospect of survival itself. Wealthy countries also have racial and ethnic differences in the risks of violent death and injury, but none even come close to the excess mortality, disability, and suffering that we have come to tacitly accept. And those stark gaps in the risks of violence do not stand alone. They are only one particularly glaring example of a much broader pattern of systemic racial inequalities in health and well-being that set the United States off sharply from every other advanced nation in the world, end quote. We know a lot about this problem and what it would take to solve it. The question is, do we want to change?
Thank you, Ms. Warnken. Thank you to all of our panelists for your comments. At this point, I'm gonna open up the questions to the commissioners. We can start with folks on the phone. I want to give them an opportunity to participate.
Madam Chair, person out here.
Commissioner Kirsenow, please proceed.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists for their testimony. It's very enlightening. A question for, I believe it's Mr. Northcross. Mr. Northcross, what are the three most important things you think would reduce violence in the Black community?
That's a good question. That's a good question. The three most important things, I think, is when we talk about violence in the Black community, we also understand that we're talking about Black men and boys commit most of the violence by far in the Black community. And of course, the only way that's going to stop, I think the main thing is organizing Black men, getting Black men to step up and take on the responsibility of guiding young Black boys in the right direction. 72% of our households are headed by single mothers today. There's a void in Black boys' lives, the ones who cause a lot of the crime in our community. So the number one thing is to get Black men to take that responsibility, to organize ourselves. Nobody else is stopping us from doing that. I don't understand why we're not organizing ourselves and come together to address this particular issue. So that's the number one thing. The number two thing is to make sure that our boys get educated, that they're in school, that they're performing in school. And I think the other thing is to prepare them to be able to work, to get, we need job opportunities, but also we need to prepare them to work. We have a generation of young men now who are not even prepared to work. They don't understand the importance of going to work on time, doing a day's work for a day's pay, and just taking pride in being able to contribute to society. So I think that organizing black men to take on that responsibility, making sure our boys understand the value of education and supporting them through their educational process and creating opportunities for them to be able to work. And I think that will reduce crime in our communities.
Thank you.
Commissioner Jones?
Madam Chair.
Oh, okay, Commissioner
Thank you
Gilchrist
so much,
will,
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Gilchrist?
Yes, Madam Chair.
You can proceed with your question.
I just want, okay, thank you. I just wanted to thank this panel for the information that they shared with us today. It was certainly enlightening, and it certainly helps to inform some of our perspectives about this issue. So I just wanted to briefly thank them for their testimony today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Gilchrist. Commissioner Jones has a question.
I too want to start by thanking all the panelists for your important testimony today and for all that you are doing in your respective areas to solve these problems, these really important problems. I'll go to Mr. Norcross. You know, based on your testimony, you are doing extraordinary work, work that I am personally very grateful to you for. It also seems to me that it should not fall on people of goodwill such as yourself to solve these problems. You ticked off a list of approximately 3 things you think would be most important at solving for this issue of so-called black-on-black crime. But let's also talk about the social determinants of criminality.
Yes.
You mentioned, for example, that only black men can solve this problem. I want to push back on that because we do have a federal government. We have governments in all of the states and territories in the United States. And there is, it seems to me, a foundational role to help solve for the issue of crime generally, and to solve for even the disparities that we are seeing along lines of race and ethnicity. Wouldn't it be helpful to you if the federal government were fully committed to solving for the issue of poverty? Wouldn't it be helpful to you if the federal government and at the state level governments were committed to solving for the issue of housing segregation? You did mention workforce opportunities, and so I imagine the answer is yes to the question of shouldn't government be fully committed to jobs training, especially in inner city communities and in black and brown communities? And while we're on the subject, let's also talk about the fact that we've got just radically unequal educational opportunities, especially along racial lines in this country. Shouldn't we also solve for that instead of it falling on people of good conscience such as yourself to try to do just yeoman's work?
Yeah, those are good questions, you know, and I'll be 65 years old in February, and I've never seen the government take this serious and come up with solutions for this problem. And so I got tired of wringing my hands and wondering what's going to happen and when somebody's going to do something about it. There's a lot of different approaches that can be taken, but I'm talking about an approach that's in our hands. I often say that black men have the means collectively to address the issue of homicides in our own community, but we just don't have the mindset to do it. When I say the mindset, I mean the mindset of bringing our resources together that we have. The great comedian Chris Rock said one time, he said that before he became the big Chris Rock, his car stopped on the side of the road, and he got out trying to stop people, flagging them down. He said the more he went, way faster they went. He said finally he started pushing his car, and when he started pushing his car, everybody started stopping. So I'm saying to black men in this country, we can't wait until everybody stops to help us. We're dying every day. And if black men come together and pull our resources together, we have more purchasing power now than we've ever had in the history of this country as black men. And this takes love to get out with our boys. We got to get in our community, let our boys know we love them, create opportunities where they want to be around us, fun activities, spend our money on things, rewarding them for doing well in school. The government can do that. They can do it too, but we shouldn't have to wait on them to do it. And if we're going to keep dying as long as we wait on them to do it, I don't believe in asking folks to do something for me that I can do for myself. We can do this, and it's empowering black men. And when we do that, the nation is going to, and the world's going to stand up and pay attention to black men who love themselves enough and love their families and their communities enough to bring our resources together and address this particular issue. And I stand on it. Again, I will say nobody can stop black men and boys from killing each other but black men and boys. That's a state of mind. We have problems in our society as inequities. I'll be the first one to admit that. But they've always been there. And we were never killing each other at the rate that we're killing each other now. We've been poor in this country for a long time. We've been without resources for a long time, but we didn't turn to killing each other the way we're killing each other now. That's another problem. And that problem lies in the black community, teaching us how to love ourselves, respect ourselves, love our women. Don't stand by and watch us kill each other. We can stop it. We have to change our mindset, brother.
I appreciate your important work and your passion. It's important, I think, especially in jobs like this. There are a lot of white men who grow up in single-parent households in America, and you don't see the same rate of violence that you've been describing. And I think that has less to do with the state of mind than it does concentrations of poverty, marginalization, and a feeling of hopelessness and helplessness that only the government can solve at that scale.
And I'm not disagreeing with you.
And it can also be true at the same time that there is a role for personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
Commissioner, Vice Chair Nurse.
Well, I want to thank all of you. You're all doing what I'd say is God's work. I mean, a lot of people think the government can solve everything, but you all are doing this on your own with very little, I'm sure. And one of the things that I'm hearing is how you're stepping up to do what a lot of people think the government already does, right? So I just want to thank you for your work and your patience and your tirelessness about this. We are a nation of doers and volunteers, and that's a great thing about us. But I really like the fact that we have other perspectives on this panel, because the one-size-fits-all just doesn't work, and we all know that. I'm happy to see we have a doctor here who is doing amazing work, because hospitals, in my experience working on violence against women and gender, they were the first to help. They were the first to give credibility that this violence existed when I started working on it in 1990. I'd just like to end, Ms. Guzman, thank you again for your work. I guess I'd want to ask just a couple of quick questions. Someone mentioned restorative justice, and I'd just like you to explain for people what that is.
Sure. So restorative justice can look like a lot of different things. We see it in schools, right? Choosing to have parent-teacher conferences and counselors intervene instead of, heavily disciplining youth. In our model at Common Justice, it looks like addressing violent felony charges in adult courts without relying on incarceration. And practically, I can explain to you sort of how that gets operationalized on sort of a daily, weekly, monthly basis in New York City where we work. So we work with DA's offices in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx, and we get cases, again, serious violent felonies. And we approach victims in these cases, a little feedback, maybe I should push this away. We approach victims in these cases and we ask them 2 questions. The first question we ask them is if they want victim services. If so, we provide them to them for life. And the second question we ask them is if they want to use our restorative justice model to resolve their case. And again, as I said, 90% of people say yes. Once all parties agree to this, the defendant in the case, who we call a responsible party, gets entered into our alternative to incarceration program. First thing we do is meet their needs, because we can't expect to hold people accountable if they can't put food on their table, if they don't have a place to sleep. They also get entered into violence intervention programming to start to dismantle some common beliefs, right? Some pervasive beliefs, just like myths that I was talking about today, myths that are ingested about violence and safety, and what it means to be part of a community. 3 to 4 months in, they enter into a restorative justice circle with the person who harmed them, or a proxy. We don't force victims to be in spaces with the person who harmed them if they don't want to be, as well as their support people and our support people, right? People who work at Common Justice. And they get to have a serious conversation about the harm that was done. Victims get to ask, why me, why this day, why this time? And they also get to set a series of community agreements that the responsible party has to follow to make things as right as possible, knowing they can't change what happened. And we call that doing sorry. A community agreement could look like, I want you to write a letter of apology to my kids, or I want you to pay financial restitution, or I want you to get a job, right? If the responsible party follows these community agreements, and if they successfully complete the alternative to incarceration program, their case gets dropped down to a misdemeanor or violation, and they don't go to jail. And I'll just share that we just had recently the Division of Criminal Justice Services in New York analyze data from our program from 2012 to 2022. Only one of our graduates has been reconvicted of a violent felony.
That's an incredible record.
I just have a general question on support, right, for the work that needs to be done. I think what I've heard through all of the testimony here is that there is a need for support in the work that we're doing, support for crime victims funds and maybe some revamping of those programs, support for victims of domestic violence, as I read in your testimony, Ms. Guzman. And so I just want to ask, as a general matter, what does support look like from the federal government in aiding the work that you are trying to accomplish?
I will speak to that. I think it's many things, and I want to kind of pan out just slightly and say, when I was hearing the conversation earlier between, is it on the community, is it government? I think multiple things can be true. We have to see this as an ecosystem. The problem is so pervasive. This is a public health crisis. So yes, we need government, and yes, we need people on the ground that are doing what they need to do for the immediate and tangible things that people need in their day-to-day lives. We really, as I said earlier, we want to make sure that we're doing things about having more complete data sets so that we can actually address the problem as we need to address the problem. And that brings in what I heard a lot of panelists say, that the solution often lies right in the community. And so if we get more complete data sets, then that's going to help us. We want to continue to figure out how we build stronger relationships with law enforcement in a lot of these communities. There's trust that's been broken, and we know all the reasons why. We all touched on it today, but I think that's important. We want to make sure that we have culturally responsive interventions, especially when we think about mental health services, and frankly, not just servicing the person that was impacted. When I think about gun violence, we often think about the person that was immediately and directly impacted, but it also goes beyond that person into family, into community, and even generationally. So we have to start to peel that away. And then, I'm Moms Demand Action, so I'm going to say it. We've got to strengthen our gun laws in this country, period, end of story. We have a crisis in this country that no other country has. And these other countries have mental health issues. They have all kinds of things that we brought up today, but they don't have this pervasive gun problem in this country. So that's what we're looking to do, and we're going to continue to work, and we'll partner with anyone that will be willing to partner with us to solve this.
Dr. Abaya?
Thank you for that question. Happy to speak to that as well. So I definitely second the need for complete but also timely data, but the local and also at the federal level to understand the nature of the problem. Because of tenet, as I said, of the public health approach is that it's data informed. And so if you don't have real-time data, you can be solving for a problem that's changing in real time. I also think that sustained kind of funding for an integration of hospital-based violence intervention type models of violence intervention programs, recognizing that these are professionals. These fields need to be professionalized. Speaking for the medical setting, these need to be reimbursable medical services that we can use to create sustainability of that model. I think that's a really important thing that can be solved for and can prevent the phenomenon by which programs are built and disappear as they rely on variable grant funding over time. And then I just want to also say, standards for law enforcement patient interactions in hospital settings, it really speaks to this bigger umbrella issue of trust. And so I think that having some standards for how law enforcement enters into medical settings and how that is negotiated so that patient trust and confidentiality is prioritized is really critical as well.
Thank you for that. Ms. Guzman, and then I'll go to Ms. Warnken.
Thank you. So I think the most important part is going to be funding a lot of these organizations that are doing the work on the ground. And part of that is also echoing what my co-panelist said earlier about finding ways to disconnect the law enforcement aspects for survivors and for victims, because not every survivor wants to involve the law enforcement or the legal system in the criminal justice system at least. That's why civil protection order cases end up being some of the most prevalent over actually pressing charges, at least in my work that I've done, because our survivors don't want to involve the police. Oftentimes they create a larger situation. Survivors end up getting arrested for actions that were nothing for them. So I think it's finding ways to fund these alternative methods and starting those on the ground with these grassroots organizations that are led by the communities that are the most affected by these issues.
Thank you for that, Ms. Warnken.
Thank you. There's so many important answers to your question. I would definitely underscore in a big way this point about untethering support from the criminal legal system, and we've talked today about some really tangible ways to do that, including like the law change in New York, one we're working on in Maryland, to redefine the victim compensation program to be more of a health and healing-oriented approach. Another thing I wanted to emphasize about this is, because again, I couldn't agree more about getting the federal resources, getting those dollars in the hands of the grassroots community-based organizations that are closest to the challenges, but there are a ton of reasons why it is very difficult for those organizations to apply for, to maintain, and keep those grants. There are many, in addition to the Herculean lift often of applying for a program and needing supports, that programs that are, for very good reason, focused on the crisis-driven needs of those that they're serving don't have the capacity to do that. But even with removing some of that red tape, even with training and technical assistance from the federal government that helps organizations get the grant, there are very arduous data reporting requirements and hurdles that oftentimes not only compromise organizations' ability to keep the grants, but actually backfire when it comes to sustaining programs or not being in good standing to receive those grants in the future if they fall short. And the last thing I'll say quickly, we talked about the VOCA rule change on compensation that's forthcoming. There was a really significant rule change in VOCA in 2016 that pretty radically reinterpreted allowable uses for those programs and was intended to expand access. It did a number of really important things, including removing a decades-long prohibition of using VOCA funds to serve survivors who are incarcerated. Many things that were not just tools for expanding access and funding the programs that we need the most, but for changing narratives around these issues that I think all of us have highlighted today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner McPentie.
Sure. Ms. Hamblett, that was great. And I appreciated the explanation on how the restorative justice approach. Could you just, not now in the testimony, but could you provide the staff more details on how your restorative justice approach works and also how we can scale that up? The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act actually has an authorization for alternatives to incarceration once there is a victimization and a finding of guilt. So that's maybe a little later on in the process, but I'm still very interested in hearing how your model works. I heard the victim compensation part, but when I was reading the testimony, I wanted to see more on what happens with the offender, and what we can do to just try to reestablish, more restorative justice in that process. So if you could just provide us later on more details, I'm sure the staff, Mark, would be very interested in hearing that, as I would, so that we can see how we can scale this up, at the federal level. And if you could also detail out, like, the different crimes, so like guns, murder, homicide, rape, burglary, to the extent that you have that, would be remarkably helpful in our study and our research.
I'm happy to provide that to you.
Thank you.
He sent you with homework. I think those are all the questions that we have. I just want to thank you all very, very much for being here today and for contributing to this conversation. You've given us a lot to think about. I hear you, data and funding and some fixes in the programs. And I appreciate that very much. So thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch for an hour, and then we're going to reconvene at, I believe, at 12:52 p.m. All right. Thank you.